my name is Brittany Rains and welcome to my presentation on community informatics. What is community informatics? It is the study and practice of enabling communities with information and communication technologies, according to the Journal of Community Informatics. Community informatics is primarily concerned with improving the well-being of people and their communities through more effective use of ICTs, according to Stillman and Dennison. Community informatics also looks at a third realm of social activity, the community, according to Williams and Durrance. Williams and Durrance also noticed social trends that gave rise to community informatics, and that is a networked society, discourse and activity around the concept of the digital divide, and the hacker ethic, the practice of building computers and writing code for the fun of it, for the creativity of it, and for the community building aspect of it. The history of community informatics starts with the establishment of the Community Informatic Research Network, CIRN, in Italy. Michael Gerstein is a founding member. The organization did lack structure and direction, and it was not able to progress as well as other fields of study did. There are two distinct areas of social interaction and endeavor, according to Day, which is the study of community use of ICT as research, and the practice of community ICT usage as practice. According to Day, there were 8 main contributors to community informatics. The Cindio and Pippamontes paper proposed a framework of 4 dimensions that characterized online communities and how they were different from regular communities and how they weren't defined merely based on geographical locations like they were in the past. The Moore's paper examines how civil society might be reconstructed through intermedia community systems such as a group authoring report support system tailored to meet the needs and constraints of the communities that grow around them. Schooler explores the relationship between practice and theory in community informatics viewed through a human-centered lenses, and Stillman focuses on issues of agency and authenticity by employing structural theory to analyze data collected through the value of using ICTs in neighborhood houses. Williamson, he highlights the relational link between practice, research, theory, and policy that underpins all community informatic activities. Froth, innovative approach to practice-based community informatics research through 5-stage research methodology. He also stresses systems to be designed in such a way as to facilitate local ownership, engagement in decision-making, responsibility sharing, and be driven by the residents themselves. This is an important contributor that I will be referring back to as I propose my solution to the problem I see in the future. Gabe and Mulholland analyzed the success in community technology initiatives globally addressing the digital divide through community connectivity, and they proposed the bottom-up grassroots approach owned and driven from within communities that have a greater scope and more potential for sustainability in the community than external intervention. And this is another contributor that impacted my research and my proposal. Taylor discusses the paradoxical nature of the impact of ICTs within context of the social appropriateness of e-government and proposes an urgent need for government agencies to value meaningful partnerships with civil society in the development of information society policy. So Gerstein also talks about community informatics in his article, Community Innovation and Community Informatics. Some of the key points that I brought out are the grassroots innovation, understood in the context of social change, where innovation is concerned with effective adaptation to changing circumstances, and also for the opportunity with a community informatics approach is for the community to have some direction and responsibility of ownership in the innovation and the innovation strategy. So this concept of ownership and grassroots movement and bottom-up approaches, they are all present in my proposal for the solution. Can we use community informatics to support human rights? By compiling the human rights violation evidence on a crowdsourced platform, I believe that we can support human rights victims by supporting access to those documentations that they have that actually expose the nature of their human right violation. The problem is that there is a lack of human rights evidence for human right violation survivors to hold officials accountable for human right violations that are owned and controlled by the victim themselves. There is a lot of evidence that is controlled by governments or even non-governmental organizations, but there is not a lot of evidence that is actually controlled by the survivors themselves. There's no place for them to hold these documentation and this evidence. And you can see from the Human Rights Protection of 2014 on the map that human rights protections are low when viewed globally. And I was actually pretty surprised of this map myself, of how low our human rights protections across the world really are. Other parts of the problem are that victims usually lack stable physical environments due to war, and access to resources to store and protect documentation is pretty much non-existent to them. They have mobile devices, but outside of those mobile devices, if they have them at all, they don't have the resources to store and protect their documentation. And the lack of control over their documentation also takes away their decision making over how that evidence is used or how they have access to that evidence. So increasing that control gives them more of a buy-in to this platform. There is a need to gather and store evidence without keeping it on physical devices. Physical devices are often damaged or lost or confiscated or stolen. So to have a place, online platform to store all this evidence and get it off physical devices allows for the victim to go back and retrieve that evidence no matter where they might be. So that goes into the need to access and retrieval of evidence to use in the future. Rather, that is sharing it with other people, sharing it with governments or non-government organizations, or crowdsourcing the evidence together to bring charges against governments or even non-governmental organizations that have been known to also violate human rights. The reason that this has allowed to evolve is because of the evolution of human rights to begin with. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights has inspired more than 80 international human rights treaties and declarations, a great number of regional human rights conventions, domestic human rights bills, and constitutional provisions, which together constitute a comprehensive legally binding system for the promotion and protection of human rights. and that was adopted in 1948. In 1976, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights entered into force. And you can see from the map that these are the different countries that have signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and some of the countries that have not signed the covenant. Both the covenants and the Declaration of Human Rights constitutes the International Bill of Human Rights. And because these bills and covenants now exist, we can now use those to hold our human rights violators accountable, because now we have documentation saying what human rights they have violated, because now we have human rights to begin with. So my proposed solution is to create an online platform that allows people to upload and save text, images, and video of human rights violations owned and controlled by the human rights victims. It will also allow them to tag documentation to reflect the location, people involved, movements, and what type of documentation type it is, and other defined elements for indexing and classification. And it would provide victims a secure, safe, and stable virtual area where documented evidence can be gathered, shared, and archived, all with the decision making at the individual level. So this goes back to Froth in the ownership of the documentation being owned at the individual level and at the very basic community level, instead of being owned at like a governmental level or even a corporate level. So how will this work? Verification for authenticity and authorship for the documentation would be built into the system. We have seen some other systems develop this. The whistle.org is one of the systems that is being created by Cambridge, and it actually allows for very quick and simple verification for that authenticity of human rights violations. And it will provide a chain of custody and safe storage for the documentation. When using evidence in court proceedings, there usually has to be a chain of custody that can be proven for the evidence that is used. And this would also have those built into the system, so you would be able to see when a file is transferred, or when a file is shared, or when a file is uploaded. It would provide that chain of custody that is so important to court proceedings and using the evidence in any kind of legal matter. And this would be a cloud-based hosting service and storage, which makes the platform accessible anywhere there is internet connection. And this is a very important aspect of this platform, is that many people who experience human rights violations are often very mobile, either because of war or mandated evacuations. They need to be able to access this information anywhere they can on an internet connection. So freeing themselves from that limitation of that hardware requirement often used for storage also makes this a little more workable. So we would not be able to have this if there wasn't the evolution of other interrelated components. So we talked about the evolution of the human rights treaties that ensure rights. We had to have that first so we could even have documents that instate our rights. Also, the international court systems to prosecute human rights violators. That also has been a fairly new development in the last 100 years. Before that, we didn't really have the international court systems that were used, especially for human rights violations. An increase in use and access to mobile devices and networks is another evolution that has allowed people to be able to use their mobile devices to document human rights violations, and the networks that allow them to be part of the larger world community. Security, encryption, and cloud-based storage are other components that have evolved, which would allow this proposal to take hold. The platform does have to be secure. It does need to be able to encrypt your uploaded photos and videos, and it would all have to be stored in the cloud. And other community platforms have evolved, which allow for us to work with them. So I've already mentioned the whistle.org, which is a verification of digital assets and digital material. And also witness.org, which is a community that helps human rights violators to document these violations. So there's like some training tips and different ways that you should be uploading these photos and video, and how you should go about documenting them, and how to stay anonymous if you would like to upload them anonymously. So both of those are good community platforms that have also evolved, which would make this proposal and solution more manageable. So the potential impact that we would have would be that this could be used in international courts to bring charges against governments and corporations for human rights violations. The more evidence we have in one place that can be verified and can be documented, the chain of custody, the more likely that evidence is going to be able to be used in international courts. It also permits a participatory approach to solving the problem of oppression. It takes and puts devices in people's hands, and they get to document their own oppression. And by doing that, they are revealing the oppressive conditions at a local level to an international level if they choose to share their videos and images and text. It increases the ownership of documentation and access to storage and retrieval of documentation. Having this ownership is a big deal, especially for victims who might not feel like they own or control anything, but to be able to make decisions based on how their documentation is shared and how it is viewed really gives them an empowerment that they lack in other parts of their lives because of things like war or just the oppression that they might face from their governments. Depending on how victims feel like sharing their documentation, it does allow the platform to gather real-time data for human rights violations and can be presented in visual format. So as people are uploading images and videos, it would give us, and that they decide to tag them with a certain location, it would allow us to see what type of human rights violations are occurring where, and even what types of violations are occurring in those locations. And it would create an online archive of human rights violations in order to measure the impact over time and to study the impact, and also so we never really lose that evidence of what types of violations were occurring, even when we had treaties and covenants saying that we had these rights. So it would just be interesting to gather all of that online and to keep it and preserve it over time. So some new directions for community informatics discussed by Williams and Durant are the emergence of data sets and how we can use those data sets to study community informatics, the globalization of the online community, and also how communities have changed on a global level. There's also been more of a turn towards theory versus practice. And with the recent expansion of community informatics curriculum in library and information science schools, there's been a refocus in direction. And some structure has been added to community informatics as a field of study, which it has lacked in the past. Thank you for listening to my presentation on community informatics.